In the darkest months of 1942, a rumor began to circulate among the sailors of the U.S. Merchant Marine. They whispered about a secret fleet being built in Florida, ships that defied the laws of physics and common sense. They weren't made of steel, and they weren't made of wood. These ships were being poured out of liquid rock. They were the concrete fleet, a desperate experiment to build an ocean-going merchant navy out of stone. To a sailor, the idea of stepping onto a concrete ship sounded like stepping into a pre-made tombstone. Common sense says that if you throw a rock into the ocean, it sinks to the bottom. Yet, during World War II, the United States commissioned 24 massive, self-propelled concrete cargo ships. This is the story of the Phantom Fleet of World War II, an engineering anomaly born of total desperation. It is a story of how the US government tried to solve a steel shortage by turning to the sidewalk beneath their feet. To understand why anyone would build a ship out of stone, you have to look at the resource ledger of 1942. As we discussed in our Liberty ship video, German U-boats were sinking steel ships faster than they could be replaced. Steel plate was the most precious commodity on Earth. It was needed for tanks, for aircraft carriers, for artillery shells, and for the Liberty ships. The War Production Board was rationing steel so strictly that companies were fighting over scraps. But there was one material that was cheap, abundant, and completely ignored by the military: concrete. Concrete is basically sand, gravel, water, and cement. You can find sand and gravel anywhere. It doesn't need to be mined or smelted in a blast furnace. The theory was simple. If we can build ships out of concrete, we save the steel for the fighting navy. We could build a shadow fleet that consumed almost zero strategic resources, but the physics of concrete shipbuilding are terrifyingly complex. Concrete has high compressive strength. You can stack a skyscraper on top of it, and it won't crush, but it has terrible tensile strength. If you try to stretch it or bend it, it cracks instantly. A ship at sea is constantly bending. It rides over waves, hogging and sagging like a giant steel beam. If a concrete ship bends over a wave, the deck is under tension. If the concrete cracks, the ship breaks in half and sinks like, well, a stone. To fix this, engineers used Ferro-Cement Technology. They embedded a dense mesh of steel rebar inside the concrete to handle the tension. This solved the cracking problem, but it created a new problem: weight. A steel ship hull is relatively thin and light. A concrete hull has to be thick and massive. The hull of a concrete ship weighs roughly 3 times as much as a steel hull of the same size. This creates a parasitic loop. Because the ship is heavier, it sits lower in the water. Because it sits lower, it needs a bigger engine to push it. Because it needs a bigger engine, it burns more fuel. So you end up with a ship that carries less cargo, moves slower, and burns more oil than a standard ship. Economically, it was a disaster, but strategically, it was a necessity. The contract to build these monsters was given to a company called McCloskey Co in Tampa, Florida. They were not shipbuilders. They were building contractors who built skyscrapers. They approached shipbuilding like a construction site. They dug massive basins in the ground, essentially dry docks carved out of the Florida mud. The construction process was a race against the clock and the chemistry of curing cement. Once you start pouring a concrete ship, you cannot stop. If you stop pouring and let the concrete harden and then pour fresh concrete on top, you create a cold joint. A cold joint is a seam where the 2 layers don't bond perfectly. It is a guaranteed leak point. So, the workers had to pour the entire hull in one continuous non-stop operation. This became known as the pour. It was an industrial marathon. For 72 hours straight, day and night, thousands of men pushed wheelbarrows of wet cement. They vibrated the mixture into the complex molds, ensuring there were no air bubbles. If an air bubble formed, it would leave a void in the hull. At sea, the water pressure would punch through that void, and the ship would sink. The result was the McCloskey-class cargo ship. It was 366 feet long and displaced about 11,000 tons. When the first one, the SS David O. Saylor, was launched in 1943, the crowd held its breath. Many people genuinely expected it to slide down the slipway and go straight to the bottom. But Archimedes' principle holds true, even for rocks. The ship floated. It sat low in the water, looking heavy and sullen, but it floated. The sailors who were assigned to these ships were horrified. They called them floating sidewalks, and Kaiser's coffins, even though Kaiser didn't build them. The psychological impact of sailing on a stone ship cannot be overstated. In a steel ship, you can feel the metal flexing and humming. It feels alive. In a concrete ship, the ride was described as dead. The heavy hull absorbed the vibrations of the engine. It didn't roll with the waves, it plowed through them. But the concrete hull had one unexpected advantage: it was quiet. Steel ships act like giant drums, amplifying the sound of the engine into the water. Concrete is a sound insulator. These ships were surprisingly stealthy to sonar. However, they were also dangerously brittle in a collision. If a steel ship hits a dock too hard, the steel dents. You can hammer it back out. If a concrete ship hits a dock, the hull shatters like a dropped flower pot. Repairing a hole in a concrete ship required a mason, not a welder. You had to chip away the broken concrete, weave new rebar, and pour a patch. The U.S. Maritime Commission ordered 24 of these self-propelled ships. They were used primarily in the Pacific Theater, serving as storeships or mobile warehouses. Because they were so slow and fuel inefficient, the Navy didn't want to use them for long convoys. They parked them off the coast of islands like Guam and Saipan. They were used to store refrigerated food, ammunition, and spare parts. Essentially, they became floating buildings, which is exactly what they were designed to be. But the most famous use of concrete ships wasn't as cargo carriers. It was as the Gooseberries of D-Day. When the Allies invaded Normandy in 1944, they needed to create artificial harbours on the beaches. They needed breakwaters to stop the waves from smashing the landing craft. They took old merchant ships, including older concrete vessels from World War I, and sailed them to France. On the order, "Sink them," the crews opened the sea valves. The ships settled onto the shallow bottom, forming a steel and concrete wall against the ocean. These breakwaters, codenamed Gooseberries, created calm water for the unloading of millions of tons of supplies. The concrete ships were perfect for this. Their heavy weight kept them anchored to the seafloor, even in storms that shifted steel ships. Some of these concrete skeletons are still visible on the beaches of Normandy today. They are the only ships from the invasion force that never left. But the U.S. experiment went beyond just cargo ships. They also built concrete barges, hundreds of them. These were unpowered vessels towed by tugs. They were built to carry oil and fuel, specifically to solve the tanker shortage. The B-7 class concrete barge was a beast. It was 360 feet long. It was basically a giant floating concrete oil tank. Building them was cheap, but towing them was a nightmare. Towing a heavy concrete block through a storm puts immense strain on the tow cables. Many barges snapped their lines in the Atlantic and drifted away, becoming ghost ships. Imagine being a sailor on a U-boat and seeing a grey, silent monolith drifting in the fog. You fire a torpedo at it. The torpedo hits. But instead of a massive explosion of steel, you just blow a hole in a rock. The concrete absorbs the blast energy differently than steel. Unless you hit the fuel tanks directly, the barge might not even sink immediately. But ultimately, the concrete ship program was a failure of economics. By 1944, the steel shortage had eased. The U.S. steel industry had ramped up production to record levels. The Liberty ship program was churning out steel ships faster than the Germans could sink them. The concrete ships took twice as long to build as a Liberty ship. They cost almost as much money because of the complex formwork and labor. And once built, they were inferior in every performance metric. They were a solution to a problem that ceased to exist. The program was cancelled before the full order was completed. After the war, the U.S. government was left with a fleet of stone ships that nobody wanted. You couldn't scrap them. A steel ship has scrap value. You can melt it down. A concrete ship has negative value. It costs money to break it up. So the government sold them for pennies, or simply abandoned them. Many were bought by companies to be used as breakwaters for logging harbours in Canada. 10 of them were towed to Powell River in British Columbia. They were arranged in a semicircle and sunk to protect the log ponds. They are still there today, the giant hulks covered in trees and moss, serving as a tourist attraction. Another famous one, the SS Palo Alto, a WWII-era precursor used as a model, was towed to a beach in California. It was sunk purposefully to become an amusement pier with a dance floor and a swimming pool. But the ocean is relentless. The concrete cracked, the ship broke its back, and it became unsafe. Today it lies broken on the beach, a sanctuary for seagulls and a hazard to swimmers. The legacy of the concrete battleships is a lesson in material science. It proved that possible does not mean practical. Just because you can build a ship out of stone doesn't mean you should. The logistics of war require efficiency, not just novelty. The concrete ships consumed immense amounts of labor and cement. That cement could have been used to build bunkers, runways, or fortifications. That labor could have been used to build more tanks. But in 1942, the fear of losing the Steel War was so high that no idea was too crazy. The U.S. pursued every option, no matter how inefficient, to ensure survival. It was a strategy of redundant engineering. If the steel supply failed, the concrete fleet was the insurance policy. Fortunately, the steel supply didn't fail, so the concrete fleet became a historical curiosity, a footnote in the massive ledger of the war. They were the ugly stepsisters of the Liberty ships. They never got the glory. They never led the convoys. They sat in the rear, heavy, slow, and unloved, but they served a purpose. They moved millions of tons of supplies across the Pacific. They proved that American engineers could solve any shortage with ingenuity. If we ran out of rubber, we made synthetic rubber. If we ran out of steel, we made stone ships. If we ran out of food, we made chocolate that tasted like potatoes. This adaptability was the true superweapon of the United States. The Germans looked for the perfect weapon, the wonder weapon. The Americans looked for any weapon that could be mass-produced. The concrete ship represents the brute force of American industry. We will pave the ocean if that's what it takes to get to Berlin. So, the next time you walk on a concrete sidewalk, imagine that sidewalk floating in the middle of the Atlantic, carrying 5,000 tons of ammunition. Imagine the men who slept in concrete bunks, listening to the muffled thud of the waves against the stone. They sailed on the most unlikely vessels in history. And they helped win the war, one heavy, slow mile at a time. The stone fleet didn't rule the waves, but it refused to sink beneath them.